Hello and welcome to We Can Work It Out, the podcast that explores the history, present and future of workers' rights. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Lord. In each episode, we'll be delving into the stories, struggles and successes that have shaped working lives. From friendly societies to people management, we welcome academics, activists, trade unionists, policymakers, writers and workers themselves to help us understand what fair work really means in a changing world. This episode's guest is Dr. Chris Kirkland, a senior lecturer in politics at York St. John University. Chris, welcome to We Can Work It Out.
Thank you.
It's great to have you on the podcast, Chris. So thank you for coming along and talking about the general strike. But first of all, can you tell us more about yourself and how you became involved in looking at the intersection of politics and history through crises?
Sure, thanks. I've always seen politics and history as interrelated, and I think one of the things I look for, and I think one of the things these disciplines talk about, is how things change. How do we get things to change? Nobody enters politics to keep the status quo, and as academics also are interested in how society is shaped, how it's developed. And I think within that we see key moments, key junctures within history as changing essentially what follows, changing direction, changing policy, changing the framing of policy, what Peter Hall calls paradigm shifts. And over the course of my life, I've always been interested in these, from the financial crisis of 2007 to 8, through to maybe the Brexit discussions and debates, as well as more recently COVID. And within each of this, there's a tendency to think of current policy as somehow exceptional, that this hasn't been done before, that we are the first generation, we are the first group to go through these things. And I think history is really good at challenging that and working out that there are these crises, these moments of change that are significant periodically throughout British politics. And that's what I focus on, really, looking at crises in the 20th century and into the 21st century in British politics.
It's a really good lens, isn't it, to analyse a topic area that, because today we're looking at the general strike, and I first came across your work because I was looking into the general strike, and you wrote a really good book, A History of Modern Britain in 12 Crises, which is a really good, as we call an angle or a lens of how we look at an issue or a problem. So in terms of the general strike, then it's 100 years this month since it happened. I think sometimes it gets forgotten, but I think obviously there's a lot of events going on at the moment to kind of celebrate it or discuss it and look at its relevance. Can you talk about why you think it is such a relevant event today, 100 years on?
Sure. This is the only general strike that Britain has ever had, the only strike to be framed in those terms. And this is the terminology used across different ideologies, both people who are supportive of the strike or were supportive of the strike, and those who have a more critical lens looking back historically. The government at the time didn't frame it as a general strike, it should be noted. But this is a period of trade union collaboration, where the TUC is able to mobilise 1.5 million workers in defence of 1 million members of the mining community that are essentially locked out from their occupation. This is a huge strike in terms of personnel, in terms of the number of people who don't perform their normal economic activity on 9 days in May 1926. This then gives it a sense of gravitas almost. The historian A.J.P. Taylor describes this as one of two key events in the interwar period, this and the Spanish Civil War of 1936. This is how important Taylor certainly sees it. And it's set about, and the general strike list is set about at a time of flux and a time of change. Remember, the Russian Revolution isn't a decade old at this period of time. Countries in Europe are looking for authoritarian solutions rather than parliamentary ones. And in the UK, there's political change. The Labour Party fast becoming the second party of British politics, replacing the Liberal Party, the collapse of the Lloyd George coalition. There's this element of change and this maybe fear of what that represents. And then comes the general strike. And the general strike doesn't quite fit into this notion of change, as I'm sure we'll come on to discuss. But this is why I think it attracts such salient? Why did it fail? Why did the aims of the TUC, why did the aims of the miners who they were supporting fail in this regard?
There's a really good book written by Professor Ralph Darlington, which is about the labour revolt, as he called it, from 1910 to 1914. You know, the general strike just didn't happen, did it? Do you think there was kind of rumblings? Obviously, I know the First World War happened as well, but do you think there was rumblings about discontent in the workplace or in society or with politics, which led up to the general strike?
I think absolutely. There are agreements between local unions. The mining union enters into agreement with the transport union and the railwaymen, uh, which essentially breaks down in 1921 in a coal mining dispute. So there are these talks, there are these discussions ongoing between different trade unions about the wider economic problems. And the wider economic problems in the 1920s become exacerbated due to a number of factors. First of all, Britain's re-entry into the gold standard in 1925, which overvalues the pound. John Maynard Keynes estimates the overvaluation is about 10%, which essentially makes British exports more expensive. In addition to this, we see other emerging markets essentially producing raw materials, especially coal. Germany, the USA, for example, undertaking expansions in their production. So we see these wider economic conditions almost coincide then with this agreement between trade unions to try and work together to try and increase their power in negotiations with employers, negotiations with government.
You mentioned the gold standard. Do you mind explaining what that is? Because that's been brought up a lot in the research I've done. What exactly was this gold standard that keeps getting mentioned around this time?
Sure. Well, the gold standard essentially fixed pound sterling, so the currency we use, to gold. And what that meant is if you had a pound, you could physically go to the Bank of England and they'd give you gold, at least in theory. There was that link between the two. And what these was designed to do was to guarantee confidence in the currency. You know the currency's worth something. You can trade it in, you could get gold. At the same time, it was designed to stabilize the currency. Each currency in the world, be they British pounds, US dollars, German Deutschmarks, whatever it was linked to gold. So you could convert your pounds into gold and then buy dollars. And there was a fixed rate. £1 was the equivalent of $4.80, for example, in the pre-war period. And what this meant is that essentially confidence was there in the economy. If you were importing or exporting things to the USA, to Europe, you had confidence in the value of the pound. Sharp deteriorations weren't going to happen. They weren't going to affect your production. Much on the same way the euro was constructed in the 1990s and early 2000s to eliminate that fluctuation in currency.
So, in terms of the general strike, then, and how it kind of started, what was the kind of background to the general strike then, in terms of the coal miners?
Well, the background to the coal mining industry was that during the First World War, the coal mines were taken under public ownership, nationalised essentially. But at the end of the First World War, the coalition government under Lloyd George returned the mines to previous owners, to private owners, in a very fractured settlement. This isn't 1945, there's not a national coal board in effect. And what happens then is those mine owners are struggling to compete with, as I said, the increased production in Germany and the USA and the wider economic conditions of the 1920s. Peace naturally brings a reduction in demand for coal. There's not the same demand for coal. There's not the same number of buyers for coal. The UK government, for example, reduces its need for coal. And this all hits the mine owners' profit, essentially. And the way the mine owners try to circumnavigate that or get around that is to reduce wages, which doesn't go down well with the miners themselves, obviously. And the government steps in 1924 and issues a subsidy. It says, rather than take wage cuts, we'll issue a subsidy, largely because there's disruption in the rural area in Germany to coal production, so they can command a slightly higher price on international markets for coal. This subsidy is due to end at the end of July 1925. The government gives a month's notice at the end of June and says, we're going to end this subsidy. The mine owners essentially then say, well, we need to cut wages and increase the length of the working day. We need essentially each miner to extract more coal per hour worked in order to maintain our profits or to maintain our industry. Following the threat of industrial action, the government undertakes a U-turn on what's known as Red Friday, the 31st of July 1925. And it issues or instructs another Royal Commission to look at the future of the industry, to look at what the industry might look like, how they can square this circle of falling profit vis-a-vis a desire not to reduce miners' wages. That commission reports back in March 1926, recommends a reorganisation of the industry, but fails, importantly, to exclude nationalisation from the debate. He says he doesn't want nationalisation, which is what the miners want, which is what the unions want, but a reorganisation. It also says that the government should end its subsidy and there should be a reduction in wages. Now, Baldwin, who's Prime Minister, says he can accept this if other parties do, knowing full well that the miners won't accept it, and indeed the mine owners won't accept reorganisation of their industry. So both sides come to loggerheads again, and essentially the mine owners post lockout notices, which say unless mine workers are prepared to come in and accept lower pay and longer working hours, don't come in at all. You don't have a job. There's no job unless you're prepared to accept those terms. The miners aren't prepared to accept those terms, so they don't go into work, and we see essentially the lockout of 1 million workers. During the period of the Royal Commission, the TUC, which is the umbrella organisation of trade unions, meet in Scarborough and overwhelmingly support the idea of a general strike in sympathy for the miners. So this would involve different workers coming out in stages to put pressure on the government to find a solution to the mining dispute. This then is a plan of the TUC, who are still negotiating with the government. They're still negotiating with the government until the first weekend in May, when their plans or when their news hit of a unofficial walkout, essentially, at the Daily Mail printing offices. The Daily Mail on the 3rd of May was due to publish editorial entitled "For King and Country," which denounced the idea of a general strike, calling it a revolutionary movement. This isn't about industrial relations. This is about wider political aims, overtaking or overthrowing the government. Print workers refused to print that, and news got to Baldwin, who essentially suspended talks with the TUC and said, there's no more talks. We can't be held hostage to this. And Baldwin saw this as a constitutional moment, an attack on the Constitution, an attack on the freedom of the press. The failure of those talks then led essentially to the calling of the general strike to take place at a minute to midnight on the 3rd of May.
Your work, like we've kind of mentioned previously, looks at the political dimension of industrial conflict as well. Before we look at what happened after or when the actual strike happened, how much do you think this general strike was a challenge to authority of the state rather than simply just a dispute over wages and terms and conditions of employment?
I don't think it was at all, if I'm honest. The TUC never saw it as a revolutionary movement. They never billed it as bad people. You had the leader of the railway union, Thomas, meeting the king in Buckingham Palace. You had strikers playing football against the police, against the armed forces. You had strikers in Newcastle handing out essential supplies to the population. These aren't the action of people who want to overthrow a government. These aren't the actions of individuals who want to undertake a revolution or a change. Taylor again notes that these are the same people that readily volunteered to protect Belgium a decade earlier. And these were people who were loyal to their country, loyal to the monarch, and essentially were loyal to the trade unions themselves. These was a part of their loyalty. These weren't revolutionaries in any sense of the word. Rather, this was about a defence for the miners. People on strike asked for nothing for themselves, but they asked for a fair deal for the miners because they saw this as all interconnected. They saw that if the miners got a good deal, this would boost the economy. This would boost them indirectly, if you like. Remember, the 1920s were not a good time economically. There was high levels of unemployment. Unemployment at this time is about 1.5 million as well. And Britain's really struggling in the economic period, exacerbated by events in the US following the Wall Street crash of October 1929 and the ensuing general slump. But this isn't a great period economically either, and it's those economic arguments that encourage workers to essentially lay down tools.
Were the government fearful of a revolution? Or the TUC and unions probably didn't, but did the government see it as that, or did they just see it as a challenge to their authority?
The government certainly billed it as a revolution. I mean, Baldwin claimed that the strike was a challenge to Parliament and the road to anarchy. And the government here tried to use the strike to suggest it was in a much weaker position than it was. And this was for a number of reasons. First of all, they wanted to present the trade union as protagonists, as people who were undertaking action which really they shouldn't, and to try to gain public support. They also wanted to use the crisis as a call to action. If you talk about a crisis, you say there's a crisis in a particular policy area, what you're doing is you're saying, look at this area again, think about this, we need more resources, we need more spending, personnel, etc. And the government did this in order to attract volunteers, essentially people to maintain supplies, to drive buses, to drive trains, and to move goods and services around the country. But this was rhetorical. I mean, the government never lost control of the military. It uses the military in the London docks and sends warships to Liverpool and Newcastle as an overreaction to the strike, but it still has the support of the military. There's no coup, there's no abandonment of posts, there's no question that the government is in control throughout this period. It's not pleasant for the government by any stretch of the imagination, but they are in control. To the extent that in February, the Home Secretary, in the middle of the Royal Commission reporting back on the future of the mines, says we've got nothing left to do but wait for the onset of the strike. You know, this doesn't really take the government by surprise, although that is the line they officially adopt.
What was the public opinion of the general strike? What was the reaction from the public? Because, and in your book as well, you talk about the different events that happened in the 80s with the miners' strike as well.
I think when we talk about public opinion and trade unions, we often sort of forget that trade unions are members of the public and have a large sway in this. In terms of how the strike played out, there really wasn't the violence that was characteristic or has been used to characterize other strikes, particularly the miners' strike that you talk about. There also wasn't really the reporting that was widespread outside of London or the main cities. So there was rather a lack of information, if you like, about the extent of the strike, or a lack of official or useful information about the lack of the strike. Both the government and the trade unions created their own newspapers, and the BBC did news bulletins, I think, about every 3 hours for those wealthy enough, essentially, to own a radio. In terms of those responding to the government's call, those breaking the strike, this was seen as a lark. This was seen as, a bit of fun. There were university students who were granted exemptions from their exams to undertake driving buses and so forth, and they were readily willing to do that. And this was essentially, as I said, a bit of fun for these individuals, predominantly from the middle classes and the upper classes. But this doesn't really transcend into public opinion or become a dividing point, mainly because it only lasts 9 days, but in the same way that other strikes would. I mean, the government was never in any danger of being defeated in an election. It doesn't have to call an election until 1929. Indeed, it doesn't. And so forth. It's not like the winter of discontent where, it has to face the electorate in 8 months, essentially.
What was the media then in perception of it, and how did they react? Because I know some of the media wouldn't report on it or refuse to report it, and or some of the workers refused to print some of the media, should I say. Did that have a damaging effect on the trade unions trying to get their message out as well, though? So even though some of the, the print workers wouldn't print some of the information, it had a detrimental effect, didn't it, eventually, because it didn't get the points across that the trade union were trying to make as well.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, the print workers at the Daily Mail walked out because they refused to print the editorial for King and Country. And this led to essentially the TUC having to call the print workers out. They had to make this an official part of the strike. Now, the academic literature's divided on this as to whether this was a weakness, whether this was the TUC shooting themselves in the foot, or whether essentially this didn't matter much. The press would have been hostile. The press would have been hostile. I think that much is clear. That much goes without saying. Instead, then, of national newspapers, there was the odd edition, very slimmed down edition of national titles. The Daily Mail, in the middle of the strike, is able to acquire printing offices in France and does print a very limited run, it has to be said, of the newspaper, which does include the editorial for King and Country. But what we see more consistently throughout the strike is we see a government-backed publication, which was led by Winston Churchill, called the British Gazette, and a TUC publication called the British Worker. And essentially, these are propaganda that are used to try to either encourage people to think everything's okay. In the case of the British Gazette, I mean, it's littered with articles saying people are at work, people are back to work. And if you think about this in terms of a news cycle, this isn't how a normal news cycle operates, right? Nobody would go and spend £2 on the newspaper that says everything's okay in the current situation. And the British Worker, in contrast, uh, advocated the message that this is an industrial dispute. There needs to be sympathy for the miners, there needs to be sympathy for mine workers, and so forth. Both papers suffered problems of circulation. Circulation was very difficult to achieve, not least because there was a railway strike. You couldn't move large scale goods from one end of the country to the other, and any trains that did run were largely reserved for essential supplies and so forth. So what we see then is we see printing problems as well in terms of the newspapers. The British Worker uses the Daily Herald's printing offices, but is raided by the police on numerous occasions. And this delays printing, this delays circulation, this delays how many physical copies of newspapers you could get.
Why was it raided by the police? What was the police's reasons for doing it?
Well, essentially, it was part of the government's crackdown on this idea of a revolution, the idea that this would be unlawful publication. Essentially, outside of the main cities, it was very hard to distribute these newspapers. And indeed, editorial in the Times did note that there were problems with the British Gazette. There were numerous reports of two copies, one folded inside the other, being delivered to people who didn't order it, people who didn't want it. So even though the circulation figures were about 200,000, the readership would be considerably less than that, I'd imagine.
Can we move on to the trade union strategy then? Looking at the decision to call the strike and whether was it a bluff from the TUC, or did they believe that they could actually win, not just a general strike, but win for the cause of the coal miners, which is what the essence of the strike was about. So what do you think was the rationale for the TUC in calling the strike, and do you think that they really thought they could win it?
Well, the TUC hoped right up until the last minute that there would be a climb down from the government, that there would be a U-turn akin to Red Friday in July 1925, that the government would either find the money for a subsidy to kick the can further down the road, or enter into negotiations about a serious reorganisation of the industry. Now, the events at the Daily Mail printing office scupper all of this. They scupper everything. The government suddenly refusing to negotiate, saying that this has turned from an industrial dispute into a constitutional crisis. And the TUC, who had no pre-warning of these actions at the Daily Mail, suddenly find themselves between a rock and a hard place. They essentially have to go through with the strike. They've called a strike. They've said this will be the repercussions if there's no agreement reached. Their other option was to retreat and essentially be humiliated, essentially say, actually, we were never really serious about this. We didn't really want to go through with this. That would have cost not only face in terms of public opinion, in terms of negotiating position with the government, but also a loss of support from their own members, essentially. Remember, people vote to go on strike. People voted to go on strike at their conference in Scarborough in September 1925. So essentially, and this is what Mason describes a strike, he argues a short general strike called off as soon as it could decently be done was a kind of ironic compromise. That there wasn't really the belief in this as a tool. The TUC weren't really convinced by this, but essentially were pushed or bounced into going through with it. And this links to wider policies of trade unions and understanding of trade union power, whereby actually trade unions want to enter into negotiations. The best way to achieve something is to negotiate and reach an agreement, not go on strike, lose money, lose pay, reduce the finances of trade unions. Trade unions were essentially bankrupt by the end of the strike. This wasn't something that they wanted. This wasn't something that they were keen to engage with, rather something they essentially felt that they had no other choice. The desire from the trade union certainly was at the end of the general strike there would be some deal, some agreement reached with the miners. That doesn't materialise either. The miners stay out until autumn and essentially are starved back into work with no compromise on pay, on hours, or on the reorganisation of the industry.
How many people took actual industrial action? Because you're saying that in trade unions were virtually bankrupt, I'm presuming because of the hardship funds and or the strike funds were utilised. How many workers took industrial action then across all industries and sectors?
So in terms of the miners, there were 1 million miners, and they were on strike for 6 months of the year. In terms of the general strike, the 9 days in May, estimates vary from between 1.5 million to about 1.7 million, but somewhere in that region. This is the largest period of industrial action ever undertaken in British politics in terms of a number of people involved.
That's a huge amount, isn't it? I mean, imagine, the population would have been a lot less then as well, the working population certainly. So you can just imagine what the daily life for people would have been like then, with all those people not working and not providing services.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the point. I mean, the TUC staggered the strike. They didn't call everybody out at the start. They held some industries back in reserve. But what you see is the idea of the general strike was to escalate, was to try and escalate the dispute until the government bowed to pressure, until people came round the table to negotiate a settlement or a better deal for the miners.
Was the conflict in between the unions at all?
No, not really. The unions themselves voted overwhelmingly for strike action, for the general strike. There was a sense that essentially the miners held a significant role in industrial relations. The miners were the best organised union in the country at the time, and indeed throughout much of the 20th century. The miners were the best organised group in terms of encouraging their members or getting their members to engage with the politics of industrial action. And essentially, this was a rallying call. This was a rallying call around the strike. The idea that this was for the miners. That this even wasn't a general strike. This was a sympathetic strike for the miners, as was advocated through the TUC's publication, The British Worker.
In terms of the government response, it was very highly organised, wasn't it? The response to the unions and what happened. What did the government have in place ready for the general strike? Was it just luck, or were they actually ready? Did they predict it, and were they ready for the general strike?
Well, the government used the 6-month period of the subsidy from July 1925 through to May 1926 to organise. And they used this time essentially to ensure that the movement of supplies could be orchestrated around the country to ensure that they could move essential supplies. They also had the benefit, as I mentioned, of the police and armed forces, should they need that. They had the benefit of strike breakers, essentially middle class volunteers, undertaking roles during the 9 days to again instill some sense of normality. The government, in its position, and Baldwin was quite clear on this, didn't want to be overly confrontational, at least directly, with the unions. And this is one reason why he sends Churchill to organise the Gazette, the British Gazette, the newspaper, because he doesn't want Churchill antagonising workers, using the army against workers, and so forth. He essentially said that there's no need to do this. We don't need to do this at all.
It sounds very familiar to the 1970s, 1980s Conservative government and Margaret Thatcher's response to the National Union of Mine Workers. They were very well organised, weren't they, in terms of stockpiling coal, and were ready for that strike. Was it very similar to what happened later on in the 1900s?
There are certainly similarities in terms of the rhetoric used. I mean, just before I go into that, one key difference was the organisation of the industry. Remember, in the 1980s, coal is nationalised. Coal is a entity owned by the government, or the industry is owned by the government, whereas in the 90s, you see more dispersed collieries, more dispersed mines. The other thing to note about the differences in the dispute is in the 1980s, the dispute's about jobs. It's about communities. It's about ensuring longevity of pits where coal is there in abundance, where coal can be extracted. Whereas in the 1920s, there isn't really that fear about jobs. It's about wages, about incomes, about protecting livelihoods in a slightly different sense. However, the similarity that does exist is the idea that Thatcher tries to present herself as neutral in the dispute. Now, I think there's a lot of problems with this from a conceptual point of view, but this is certainly her idea and her tactic, to say that this is a dispute between the NUM, between the miners' union, and between the National Coal Board, the NCB, led by Ian McGregor. And essentially, Thatcher says, look, we're only using our job here is to maintain order, to maintain law and order. This is our job. This is what we're doing. We're looking at police resources and what have you. We're not getting involved in the dispute. Now, of course, that's nonsense. They're directly involved in the dispute, and they're using the police in such a manner as to facilitate a particular narrative in the dispute, i.e., those who want to go into work, particularly in coalfields in Nottinghamshire and elsewhere. But this is where the similarity comes. The government says, well, and I think this really weakens the government's idea of it being a revolution. The government doesn't try to stop people in the same way that Thatcher does in the 80s. So there's no large scale arrests. There's large scale arrests in the miners' strike, the vast majority of which are released without any charge. And there's no violence in 1926, or more limited violence in 1926. As I said, you have instances of those on strike playing football against police officers. I mean, can you imagine that happening at Orgreave?
Absolutely not, no.
Or anywhere else in the miners' strike?
There'll be a few tackles going in, but I don't think you can see it nowadays, no. In terms of the conclusion of it then, how did it come to a conclusion? I won't call it a resolution, but how did it conclude eventually, the general strike?
Well, it's essentially, as I said, the unions were almost desperate for some resolution. The unions realised they couldn't keep this up financially. They couldn't keep up the number of people off work. They thought they could negotiate some sort of settlement with the government on the case of the miners if they returned to work. Baldwin made it clear that while there's a general strike, there's no chance of negotiation. So the trade unions essentially call off the strike for that myriad of reasons, on the idea that this will then enable talks with the mining unions. And essentially that doesn't materialise either. That doesn't come about. There's still no There's still no settlement reached with the miners, who stay on strike until the autumn, and are essentially defeated in that. Both strikes are defeated. Miners return to work with lower wages, longer working hours, and the TUC gain no concessions on behalf of the miners.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it seems, a lot of people think that the TUC lost, but then there's a knock-on effect, wasn't there, in terms of strikes for the future? Like you mentioned before, there wasn't another general strike since that point as well. And it is impossible at the moment to have a general strike. In terms of how people look at the general strike then of 1926, are there any kind of misconceptions about what the strike was about and what happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government's narrative is prevailing. I mean, history is written by the winners, right? So the government's narrative sort of prevailed, and the government passed legislation in 1927 under the Trade Disputes Act. Now, this limits the role of workers to go on sympathetic strike, and also importantly, it limits the links between the Labour Party and the trade unions. So it replaces the process of contracting out with a process of contracting in. So before 1926, if you joined a trade union, you were automatically registered as a Labour Party member, as a Labour Party supporter, unless you explicitly said you didn't want to. You had to go and fill in a form to do this. The reverse is true following the Trade Disputes Act of 1927. Now, if you join a trade union, there's no link to the Labour Party. You have to contract in. You have to say you want to do this. And the idea here is people are lazy, forgetful, insert your own word here, and never quite fill in that paperwork. So Labour membership drops. And Labour throughout this period have to look far more readily at individual membership. They're already doing part of that because of the enfranchisement of women from 1918, but they have to look far more at individual membership rather than the ties with the trade unions. This legislation's important not just in terms of its consequence, but also in undermining the government's position in terms of the idea of a revolution. There were powers for the government to step in and suppress revolutions. There's powers left over from the First World War in terms of the defence of the state. The fact that the government has to make specific legislative changes in response to the events of 1926 demonstrates that they weren't illegal, demonstrates that they weren't revolutions. And Keith Laban makes this point quite effectively. He said, well, if these were illegal, why didn't the government stop them? If it's a revolution, the government still got control of the army, you just go and stop it. The fact is, it wasn't. The fact is, this wasn't a revolution, and the government, despite the rhetoric, never really believed it was. It was useful rhetoric and it served a purpose. And we see this throughout crises, that narrative served purposes throughout crises. But the fact that they had to pass subsequent legislation to prevent these events occurring in the future demonstrates that they weren't serious about it being a revolution.
In terms of today, then, if we bring it forward to what's happening today, there has been an increase or resurgence in strike activity, which you'll know better than anybody can be related to, with the Labour Party being voted in or with economic crisis, whatever you want to level it at. How can we relate what happened in the general strike to kind of modern day, I would say, first of all, trade union activity and then strike activity? Has it had an influence? Do people look back and think, yes, we need to do more things like what happened in 1926? Is there a really good connection to the resurgence in strike activity into what happened and what was going on 100 years ago?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of legacies to take. Firstly, as I mentioned, that relationship between the Labour Party and the trade unions. Labour in the 1920s, as I said, are coming to the fore as the second party in British politics, but still being pulled in multiple directions. What is the party for? I mean, what does the party believe in terms of socialism? Is it a socialist party? What does that look like in practice? Following the defeat in 1926 of the trade union, Labour's unequivocal. It says that anything that the Labour Party does must be done through a parliamentary means. There's no radical socialism. Socialism is going to come through parliament, through election, through voting it in. And the TUC adopt a similar approach. They say, look, we just can't do anything radical. It doesn't work. We don't have the resources at our disposal to do it. We've got to work within much stricter confines. And it pushes both the Labour Party and the TUC to the centre of British politics or towards the right, or certainly of where they were previously. I think the other thing to say about some of the similarities between 1926 and more recent industrial action is language used. The language used in 1926 was quite clear. The strike was the fault of those undertaking industrial action. It wasn't a collapse in negotiations. There was no blame being placed upon the government, certainly in terms of the government's rhetoric. And we see this materialize time and time again throughout British politics. That it's those who undertake action do so almost unilaterally. They do so not because there's a breakdown in discussion, not because the employers are being unreasonable, but rather because they're self-interested, because they want better pay and conditions. And I think this framing also has elements associated with conflict, with war, with death. And we see this numerous times in the 1930s 70s in the winter of discontent. We see this again in the 90s. Thatcher was famously going to label the miners the enemy within, comparing them to the Argentine invasion of the Falkland Islands. And she was going to do this at a conference speech in Brighton, and only dropped that language because the IRA bombed her hotel. So we see this language, we see this narrative emerge. And I think the other similarity, and the other point I'd make about this, is to go back to Taylor's point that the people engaged with the strike were those who essentially ran to Belgium's aid and rescue and fought for Britain in the First World War. We see similarities here in terms of COVID. People who we were clapping for during COVID, people who were going into work, people who had to have special exemptions to allow them to go into work, healthcare professionals, sport workers, etc. When they went on strike at the end of or after COVID took place, we returned to this language of sectional interests. We returned to this language of people who maybe aren't as caring about the effects of their actions or about society. And there's an odd juxtaposition there between how they're reported in one sense when it's beneficial perhaps to the wider public or those who are able to set the agenda, versus how they're framed, how the discourse is framed when perhaps there's something that they don't like, or those who control the narrative don't like taking place.
We've got a voluntary system, I think, of industrial relations in the UK in terms of the government or the state doesn't like to get involved. Do you think the government did get heavily involved at the time, or they tried to leave it to the private owners of the coal mines?
1926, I think the government were involved. I mean, the government knew that they could essentially end the strike by brokering a deal with the miners, or even engaging seriously in attempting to do so. The fact that Baldwin declares this as a revolution and says, no, we're not going to engage at all until the end of the general strike, is essentially taking side. It's government saying, we don't like this, we're not interested in this tactic, we're not going to engage with your point of view. And we see this come out periodically. I mean, remember, the government sets legislation, it sets parameters for strike, sets what's permissible and what's illegal during strike action. The government, although on the day of the strike may profess neutrality, but of course they've set the boundaries, they've set the framework. And one example of this is in contemporary ballots to go on strike. The government says any ballot to go on strike now must not only have a majority of people saying yes, but it must have a turnout of over 50%. So therefore, anybody who doesn't vote makes a strike harder. You know, it's not like they're neutral in it. They're actively affecting the ballot. If the government was neutral in it, then the decision would be taken purely by the trade union concerned.
It's a fascinating time, really. And your book covers this in one chapter, but it's the way you've analysed it through crises. So you start out in your book, which is the history of modern Britain in 12 crises. You start out looking at the constitutional crisis of 1909-10, all the way through to the COVID-19 as well. I know you've written the book about this. Would you call the general strike of 1926 crisis? Would you generally label it as that?
Yes, I think it is a crisis because during the 9 days, at any point in the 9 days, it had the potential certainly to escalate. I am very conscious of labeling things as crises from the vantage point of history. We know how this turned out. We know what happened. We know what materialized. But I mean, if you've got 2.5 million of people not undertaking work, plus a further 1.5 million people who are economically inactive, that is a big problem. That's a huge problem for society. I think also it poses a question of crisis in a number of relationships. The relationship between the trade unions and political organisations, predominantly the Labour Party, but also the question of how to achieve changes to the political status quo. It wasn't a revolution, and it was never orchestrated in the guise of a revolution. But at the same time, it's not too difficult to see how this centralises or confirms Parliament's position within British politics. I think, to just go back to the point about comparing crises, and that's one of the things I'm very keen to do in the book, I think in contrast to other crises, the prospect of civil war in Ireland, either global world wars, and so forth, I can see how this might not look as imminent as a crisis, but I think it still warrants the term crisis as a conceptual framework. And I think the term crisis offers something to um, understanding the events. I mean, whatever we think of the government's narrative, the idea of the government saying that they're fighting off a revolution is something we need to take notice of.
I certainly think it was a crisis at the time, and when you go through the numbers of people that were involved, and it could have tipped, it could have tipped one way or another in terms of being a revolution or being something which could have really toppled governments or changed the constitution in some ways. I certainly think it is a crisis, and I think that's the way it should be looked back upon, not in a negative way or necessarily a positive way, but in a way where, it was the sheer numbers of people that were involved in terms of strike, of taking strike or industrial action, supporting the strikes, the number of volunteers, the number of people that backed the government. It could have led down a really dark alley at some point, and I think it should be viewed in that point. And comparing it to the other things, so comparing it to the things you talk about in your other chapters in your book, it's a great way of saying, actually, yes, this is a really important event that happened.
Yeah, and that point was made by John Clines, the former Labour deputy leader. And he said, look, this only didn't become a crisis. This only didn't become a revolution because the TUC were hell bent on stopping it, basically. They could have easily said to their workers, right, guys, we've got no more strike money. You're on your own now. You go back to work or you starve, essentially. And he makes this point quite eloquently. And he said that would have invoked a revolution. The TUC spent millions stopping this becoming a revolution and preventing it from being so. And here, then, this comes back to one of the key themes that we've touched upon, the idea of trade unions actually as quite moderate in some of these processes, rather than the instigator of action and so forth. The TUC actually is there to broker a deal, is there to try and say, okay, we do want better conditions for our workers, but at the same time, this doesn't come at the expense of everything else. Pragmatic in that sense, and we understand some of the limitations to that. And again, he goes back to this idea of challenging the government's narratives. The TUC certainly didn't act as a revolutionary vehicle, and were quite focused on preventing any revolutionary intent from their members.
Well, it's a fantastic chapter within your book. We'll put a link in for our listeners to gain access to it. It's a history of modern Britain in 12 crises. It's like I mentioned at the very start. It's a great way a great lens of looking at and analysing events in the 1900s. What we do at the end of each podcast is ask our guests a couple of questions, which are exactly the same. So, what are you working on next, Chris?
I've got a couple of projects ongoing. Two very different projects. The first looking at COVID and looking at again some of these narratives in comparison, the idea of key workers, and essentially asking the question, what happened to the key workers? Where are the key workers now? Not necessarily in terms of where they are on a day-to-day basis, but where did this language go? We all stood outside our houses in the pouring rain clapping for them, and all of a sudden this has disappeared. The second element I'm looking at is I'm currently undertaking a project exploring British by-elections and how they change or don't change politics, with a focus on the period, again, 1918 to the present day.
Okay, well, they sound two interesting pieces of research you're doing there, and with the political landscape at the moment, I'm sure it'll be interesting with the by-election analysis and the history of it as well. We also ask each guest to choose either one person or a group of people or an event, we're winding it to, who you believe has influenced the world of work. Who would that person or group or event be, and why?
I think the event I'm going to pick is COVID. I realise this might be a bit of a cop-out, sorry. But I think COVID has many similarities to some of the other things we're talking about. And the failure to learn the lessons of COVID really does advance workers' understanding of workers in a number of ways. For a start, we're suddenly talking about work as its function within society. Not how much money people make, not how wealthy people make, but what's the core element of society? What do we need as society in terms of people in work? And we need people to work in um, the supply chain. We need people to work in supermarkets. We need people to work in transport. And again, then the question is, why doesn't this manifest itself post-COVID? The other thing I think COVID really does change is this idea of much greater rights for some workers, admittedly not all, but the idea to work remotely, not work at home, but work remotely. And I think there's an important distinction there. The idea that workers can have much greater say and much greater flexibility over the terms of their employment. The idea that technology, that work catches up with some of the advancements in technology, which allows for much greater upskilling of workers and so forth. And again, it's unfortunate that that hasn't transcended through into more contemporary discussions of employment rights and employment legislation. The third thing that COVID does, it again demonstrates the power of the state. The idea that the government, a conservative government committed to austerity, I should add, introduces a furlough scheme that basically says we don't want unemployment to skyrocket. We want to protect workers. We want to protect employment where we can. We understand there's these benefits outside of financial benefits for people to remain employed, and we want to protect that. And again, it's a bit unfortunate that, I mean, that could easily transcend through to seasonal work and seasonal occupations and hasn't yet done so. Hopefully it will. I'm not holding my breath, but all of these changes come in COVID and show the possibility of what employment could look like, or how employment could be constructed in British society. Sadly, there hasn't seemed to be the political will to create a paradigm shift or a change in the overarching framework of employment. But COVID certainly demonstrates that's possible if the political will matches it.
I completely agree with that. I think there was a lot of research at the time and just after COVID around its impact and what was going on, but it seems to have dissipated somewhat. And in terms of its importance, I've noticed within the HE sector, higher education sector, and speaking to private sector organisations and public sector organisations as well, there's been a huge shift in the mindset of workers, in the mindset of employers. You know, some who are determined that they will workers do have to come back into the workplace, but a huge amount of employers are kind of willing or just accepting the fact that people can work remotely and probably seeing the benefits of it. The CIPD did a good piece of research just after COVID, and I think it was 2/3 of employers said there was either no impact on productivity or there was increase in productivity with their workers who did work remotely. So there needs to be a bit more of a discussion about it, and it's good that you're looking at it because I think it had a huge impact on the UK. I think people don't realize how big on the workplace that impact has been.
Yeah, I think it showed how useful technology can be. I mean, writing 100 years ago, or almost 100 years ago, Keynes argued by now we'd be working 4-day weeks because technology would enhance our jobs, enhance our productivity. And throughout the second half of the 20th century, we see a tension almost between technology and automation and employment, rather than seeing these as interlinked. Certainly within political discourse, the idea that technology is going to replace these workers, or replace certain workers, and this is a big problem for society. But essentially what Keynes was saying is people would feel better, people would be better, and people would have better lives. And the history of employment, if you look at the history of employment, has been people working fewer hours, more time for leisure, more time to spend money, more time to boost the economy. You know, the key sector in the UK economy now is tourism, is leisure activities, basically.
Yeah, it does. The Factories Act, when that was brought in, reduced the number of working hours for women and children, didn't it? So you can see that lineage from the Industrial Revolution onwards. And there's lots of research, at University of Salford, they're doing research into the 4-day working week. They're trialing it in certain companies as well. And I can see the opposition to it from an employer perspective. But you have to look at the bigger picture and, are people more productive? Is it better for the company? And that's what a lot of these, what I would say, advanced companies are looking at does it have an impact on productivity, and is it better for them and for the worker? And in some industries, it won't apply to obviously all industries, but in some industries, it will be beneficial. for everybody.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, it's about that balance that we always seek to find between work and, I mean, we call it a work-life balance, as if work is somehow separate from life. Sometimes it may feel it, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that binary distinction. Yeah, just improving that and improving, improving personal well-being, improving personal relationships, and things like that would be a huge benefit.
Okay, well, it's been a fascinating discussion, Chris. I highly recommend people to go out and get your book, History of Modern Britain in 12 Crises. It looks at different aspects of what happened um, in modern Britain through that lens of crises. It's a really, really good book. I really enjoyed, obviously, the chapter around the general strike, but it does cover other crises that's happened over the last 100 or so years. So, Dr. Chris Kirkland, thank you for joining us on We Can Work It Out.
Thank you for having me.